Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're taking a look at a truly epic 39-year journey of the operating system that basically built modern personal computing. We're talking about Microsoft Windows. But you know what's really fascinating here isn't just the software code itself. It's actually this constant, incredible tug-of-war between software ambition and hardware limitations. Think about it. Every single time developers dreamed up some flashy, visually stunning new feature, they either had to sit around and wait for the physical hardware to catch up, or they just pushed the hardware so incredibly hard that it forced the entire tech industry to evolve.
Okay, let's dive into this. To really wrap our heads around the sheer scale of this evolution, just look at this massive contrast. Back when Windows 1.0 launched, it needed just 256 kilobytes of RAM to run. Fast forward to today, and Windows 11 demands a hard minimum baseline of 4 gigabytes. Now, just to put that into perspective, 4 gigabytes is 4 million kilobytes. We are literally talking about a mathematical explosion in computing power and memory demands, all driven by this relentless pursuit of a better, faster, and way more secure user experience.
So how exactly did we get from 256 kilobytes to 4 gigabytes? Well, we're going to break this nearly 4-decade history down into 5 distinct computing eras: the early DOS shells, the Start menu revolution, uniting consumer and enterprise, the modern UI shift, and finally, the Windows 11 hardware walls.
All right, kicking things off with era number 1, the early DOS shells, and the quest to break the infamous 640 kilobyte memory barrier. Picture this, it's 1985. Back then, Windows didn't even start out as a fully independent operating system. Windows 1.0 was basically just a simple 16-bit graphical shell sitting on top of MS-DOS, designed for the Intel 8088 architecture. Get this, you didn't even need a hard drive to run it. You could boot the entire thing directly from a couple of dual, double-sided floppy disk drives. Incredibly humble beginnings for something that was about to become an absolute global juggernaut.
Through the late 80s, things moved fast, mostly in incremental jumps. In '87, Windows 2.03 finally brought us overlapping windows, which, believe it or not, was a massive deal, replacing the old, clunky tiled look. But check out 1989 right there on the timeline. Windows 2.11 is a huge architectural milestone because it was the very first time Microsoft officially demanded a physical hard disk for installation. The floppy era was fading, and by 1990, Windows 3.0 drops, giving us the iconic Program Manager and pushing memory boundaries even further.
That brings us right to our second era, the Start menu revolution, exploring the legendary mid-90s releases we all remember, codenamed Chicago and Memphis. This quote really hits the nail on the head. It perfectly captures the total paradigm shift of Windows 95. It was an absolute global phenomenon. I mean, people were literally lining up outside stores at midnight just to buy a box of software. Windows 95 fundamentally established the modern desktop layout as we know it today. The Start button, the taskbar anchored right there at the bottom, Windows Explorer for navigating your files, these were incredibly radical interface innovations in 1995, and they were so successful, we're still using them right now.
That whole 9X era, spanning from Windows 95 up to Windows ME, was just packed with consumer-friendly innovations. Microsoft combined Windows with MS-DOS to make everything so much easier to use. They gave us plug-and-play so you didn't have to manually configure your hardware anymore. And by Windows 98, we actually got out-of-the-box USB support. Windows ME even threw in System Restore. All of this made computing super accessible for the average home user. But there was a catch. This consumer line relied on a hybrid 16 and 32-bit architecture. Because of how it was built, if just one program crashed, it often dragged the entire system down with it, leading to those completely infamous blue screens of death.
So to fix those glaring stability issues, Microsoft had to change their entire approach. And that leads us to part 3, uniting consumer and enterprise through the NT unification. Let's move to and see how this builds, because while everyday consumers were dealing with the Crash Pro 9X series, Microsoft had this parallel team, led by a guy named Dave Cutler, building Windows NT, which stood for New Technology. And this was engineered completely from the ground up as a pure 32-bit operating system. It was designed specifically to handle the heavy, critical security and scalability demands of corporate networks and enterprise workstations. Seriously, it was a totally different beast under the hood. And this brilliantly illustrates the exact divide Microsoft was facing in the 90s. On the consumer side, with the 9X architecture, a simple user mode software crash could easily breach the system and ruin your day. But on the enterprise NT side, NT utilized what's called a hardware abstraction layer, or HAL. This was an ingenious piece of engineering. It physically isolated the core system software, the kernel, from the direct hardware pathways.
Basically, if an application crashed, the kernel stayed protected behind this layer, ensuring exceptional, rock-solid stability.
Now, the obvious challenge here was that Microsoft couldn't afford to maintain two completely separate operating systems forever. They had to bridge the gap. Windows 2000 started that process by refining the NT kernel, but the real triumphant unification, that finally happened in 2001 with Windows XP. XP is legendary for a reason. It finally brought that crash-resistant, enterprise-grade NT stability directly to everyday consumers. It completely wiped out the old DOS-based 9X architecture, secured the operating system's future, and paved the way for native 64-bit editions. A real game-changer.
With stability finally locked down, Microsoft's designers were totally free to dream bigger. Which brings us to part 4, the modern UI shift. This is the era of Aeroglass, live tiles, and the move toward continuous innovation.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is watching how software ambitions started severely testing hardware limits once again. Just look at how the baseline skyrocketed. We went from needing a tiny 640 kilobytes of RAM for Windows 3.0 up to half a gigabyte for Windows Vista and all the way to 2 gigabytes for Windows 10. Minimum storage, that jumped from a meager 6 megabytes up to 32 gigabytes. These massive leaps in hardware requirements were absolutely necessary to fuel the heavy, modern graphical interfaces and the complex security layers Microsoft was rolling out.
This whole era was truly defined by bold UI experiments. You remember Windows Vista, right? It brought us the beautiful translucent arrow interface. But man, its heavy hardware demands and those constant user account control security pop-ups caused some major slowdowns on older PCs. Then Windows 7 came in and just brilliantly optimized that performance, finding the perfect sweet spot. Afterwards, Windows 8 took a massive risk with a touch-centric interface that completely removed the Start menu. Unsurprisingly, that alienated a lot of traditional mouse and keyboard users. But ultimately, Windows 10 found a lasting balance, blending the classic desktop with modern features like Cortana and officially transitioning the OS into a service with continuous annual updates. And this cycle of continuous evolution brings us right to the climax of our hardware-software dance. Part 5. The Windows 11 hardware walls, establishing a very strict security baseline.
When Windows 11 launched in October 2021, it made massive headlines by doing something really drastic. It completely ended native 32-bit processor support. Why on earth did they do that? Well, during the Windows 10 era, a lot of low-cost devices were sold with tiny 32GB eMMC storage drives, and they were literally choking. The operating system, the recovery partitions, and those constant feature updates just swallowed up all the space, making it impossible for those devices to update. Microsoft realized they had to force a much higher baseline if the OS was going to keep moving forward.
So the crucial point is that Windows 11 disqualified a vast amount of older hardware right out of the gate. To upgrade, you suddenly needed a compatible 64-bit multi-core CPU, 4 gigabytes of RAM, 64 gigs of storage, active UEFI firmware, and without a doubt the most controversial requirement of all, a Trusted Platform Module, or TPM, version 2.0. As for why this matters to you, this represents Microsoft drawing a hard line in the sand, prioritizing mandatory security baselines over universal backwards compatibility.
And to be fair, things like TPM 2.0 and Secure Boot aren't just arbitrary walls designed to force you to buy a new computer. They are absolutely vital architectural shifts for modern cybersecurity. By requiring TPM 2.0, Windows 11 can actually isolate your sensitive security credentials directly inside a physical hardware chip on the motherboard. This creates a highly secure enclave that actively shields your system from sophisticated modern exploits. Think deep-level malware, ransomware, and firmware-level attacks. The traditional software antiviruses alone simply cannot stop.
And guess what? The hardware demands aren't stopping there. With the recent rollouts of Windows 11, specifically version 24H2, we are officially stepping into the AI era. Microsoft is actually retiring the older Cortana Assistant to seamlessly integrate Copilot. This brings incredible real-time task automation and generative AI features directly into the core of your operating system, breathing entirely new life into legacy apps. But to run these localized AI models smoothly, the operating system is once again leaning heavily on newer specialized hardware processors. Which leaves us with a pretty fascinating prospect for the future. We've traced this incredible journey from 256 kilobytes running on a floppy disk all the way to 4 gigabytes of memory secured by dedicated cryptographic hardware chips. As generative AI becomes even more deeply embedded into our daily workflows, it raises the ultimate question:
Will a future operating system, perhaps a Windows 12, set an even higher, AI-specific hardware baseline? The dance between software ambition and hardware capability continues, and honestly, it is more exciting than ever. Thank you for joining me on The Explainer today, and keep your eyes on the horizon.